Well, everybody, it's great to be with you again on the Everyday Monks podcast, the podcast offering of St. Benedict's Anglican Church, Reformed Episcopal in Rockwall, Texas. And it's great to be back. We've had a bit of a break for various reasons, and I'm joined here with my good friends and fellow monks, Timothy Wilson, and to my left, the Reverend Michael Keith Templin, staring directly at me from across the table, and our good friend, the Reverend Mark Toombs from Redeemer, Rockwall Presbyterian Church. Mark, it's always great to have you here as kind of not really a guest. You are a monk, but, coming in from another perspective and joining us. And we're grateful to the people at Redeemer for allowing you to do this and be with us. And, we've got a few things to talk about today, gentlemen. And we'll try and get into everything, but it's just good to be back. How's everybody doing? Father Templin, how are you?
I'm doing fantastic. I feel like I'm in rare form this afternoon.
Is that right?
Yeah.
Well, we don't edit these, so just a little self-editing and filtering might be called
Might be. Yeah, we had a good Guiso Verde this afternoon. And,
Guiso Verde.
It was fantastic, as always, to our corporate sponsor, Tiamon.
Yeah, we really need to give a shout-out to Tiamon here in Rockwall. In my opinion, the best Mexican food around.
It really is.
It is.
If you haven't been there yet and you live in the Lake Ray Hubbard area, give it a try.
Now, I have to say, there has been a steady increase on their prices.
Well, we talked about this. So as people begin to realize what a good place it is, of course, starts getting busy. You start seeing those prices creep up because market demand and things are changing, Father Templin.
Too many gringos.
Well, that's part of it, but that'll be a
blame you guys for that.
Time. Don't be blaming us, Reverend Mark. Timothy, how are you doing over there?
Doing very well, thank you.
Okay, good. Man, a few
What
words.
are you studying over there?
Yeah, we got a lot of papers.
I was just looking through our presenters. We just finished the Anglican Way Institute conference this year, 2025.
Let's talk about that. So, what was that, last week?
It was.
It was, yeah.
Gosh, so Timothy, why don't you give us a little overview of kind of what the conference was about and who all was there?
We had a conference on the ecumenical councils of the church, commemorating the 1700th anniversary of Nicaea.
Wow, that's some staying power right there.
It is.
We had a number of presenters. We had Dr. David Maxwell. He taught on the Constantinople II and the reception of Chalcedon.
Yep.
We had Dr. Jeffrey Bingham. And
Which he was great, wasn't he?
He was very good. I enjoyed him.
Yeah.
He talked on
Really
the
engaging.
third and fourth councils.
We had a Lutheran scholar, didn't we?
That was Maxwell.
That was Maxwell.
Okay.
And then we ended up with the very Reverend Dr. Chad Hatfield, and he spoke on the Seventh Council.
We also had D. Blair Smith,
right.
Presbyterian scholar,
Right.
which is he's moving to Dallas, isn't he?
Has he been RTS?
I think he's
that's what he mentioned.
taking over the seminary there.
Yeah.
Is that right?
Yeah.
That's what I understood.
Okay,
Yeah.
good to know. Yeah, and of course, our own Bishop Sutton opened up the conference with the first plenary and kind of set the table for the 7 councils. And so let's just, Mark, let's go to you. So you were there. What are some of your initial thoughts, takeaways? What did you think?
Well, I think that it was incredible to be at the conference where you had all these world-class scholars.
Right.
I felt with every one of the plenary speakers that they were basically taking a little dipper of water out of their giant barrel and saying, "Here, I can give you this to drink, but there's a lot more where that came from." So it was like drinking out of a fire hydrant in some ways. It was so much information. And then what would get me is the questions that people would ask, like the very detailed questions and the background. I was like, man, I wouldn't even know where to begin with that. But I felt like it was worth every penny and all the time we spent over there.
Yeah. What about you, Father Templin?
I had a wonderful time. I really enjoyed David Maxwell and Dr. Bingham's lectures, and they were kind of polar opposites in their presentation. Bingham, was I think far more approachable in his lecture style, which I heard a few comments from, there's a lot of clergy at the conference,
Right.
but there's also a lot of people that aren't clergy, and a lot of those people gravitated towards Bingham's lecture.
Yeah.
But then I thought Maxwell was a really fine presenter, and I did like D. Blair Smith. He had a very tough task, though, I think, trying to set up Nicaea
Yeah.
in one session and talk about it with all of the stuff that was going on. But I thought he had a very informative lecture. So I thought everything was really good. Worship was great. The sessions outside of
the
the
workshops.
plenaries were really good. So
Yeah, I attended a couple of really good workshops. There's always good workshops, but
Yeah.
I just thought that everything, because it was such a focused topic,
Yeah.
so the workshops were tight and around in the orbit of the main idea of the councils, and I did feel like I was drinking out of a fire hose, though. I mean, it was
Yeah.
a lot
Yeah.
of content in 2.5 days to get through. And I told somebody, I'm like, thank goodness there's only 7 councils. The 12 councils, it's like, good grief. But Timothy, what about you? What were your takeaways?
I enjoyed every one of them.
Yeah.
I would have liked to have gotten a little more in depth on the Seventh Council. I mean, we
I agree with
think
you on
we
that.
we danced all around it, but
Well,
didn't really hit the meat of it. But
Yeah.
he gave us an article to read,
We did get an article to read.
which I'm sitting here like
Are you reading
just,
it right now?
I'm just perusing it.
Oh, okay.
you know.
All right. Is it any good?
Well, so far.
Okay.
But it's important that we understand how important that the councils were. I mean, they did give us guardrails, especially when it comes to the heresies, because these councils provide boundaries, if you will, for Orthodox teaching, ensuring that interpretation of Scripture remains within the faith once delivered to the saints.
Yeah. No, I agree. And I was going to ask, whoever, but I mean, so, you pulled together, I mean, there was good attendance, right?
yeah, it was
One of the better
probably
attendance.
150 or 60
It was
people
really
there,
good
I think,
attendance. And we usually have good attendance anyway, but this seemed like it was a very engaged group.
Yeah. Yes.
Which, Reverend Toombs, were you surprised that something so theological and, I mean, like it wasn't like, Christianity in the modern age or, but it was like the councils.
Yeah.
Were you surprised, or what do you take away from maybe the hunger or just the desire and intensity for people like wanting to engage with the councils of the church? And where does that fit kind of in the larger cultural moment we're in within the Christian church?
I guess I wasn't totally surprised. I mean, given the circles we run in, I think our people are probably thinking about the creeds. They recite the creeds in worship and wanting to know where they came from, the circumstances around which they were formed. I was encouraged to see so many younger people there. So whether they were children of clergy or college students or whoever, that was really encouraging. And my own son was there, and
Right.
he was on cloud 9 the whole time. So it was great. And I think that gave me a lot of hope, just not looking to the past, but also looking to the future. Like, okay, if the creeds mean this much to clergy, but also to the people we're serving and loving, that was really encouraging for me because they were hanging in there.
I kind of think of the councils, really in the way like what can be, but but being unburdened by what has
You're really going to bring that back? We're at that point in the podcast as you guys start rehashing that. Wow.
But think about it. The future of the church, what can be, but unburdened by what has been in the councils. It's the.
Are you making a joke?
The ancient brought into the
Oh,
future.
okay. Are you trying to be serious? Are you trying to be serious?
Well, also, I was struck by the fact that Nicaea 1, I mean, that is so foundational for all the other councils.
Oh, right.
They never got away from it.
Right.
And they had to deal with it like almost like looking at a diamond with different facets. They had to deal with a variety of things, but all related to that. They didn't discard the earlier councils just to have a new council, in other words.
Yeah. There's just further explication. They would come up with a statement, they would find clarity, and then another 50, 60, 80 years would go by, and they find that, well, they'd have to come back to the table, and we need to kind of reorient here because now new interpretations and ways that people are thinking about things is taking some folks off track. And but you brought up what was that stat you brought up when we were there talking? I think it was 78%.
Oh, it was that.
For Ligonier
yeah.
State of Theology.
And what was the stat you mentioned to me at
I
the
have
conference?
to look back at the stats.
Wasn't it
It's
like 70-something% of Christians?
not quite that high, but
Okay.
if you look at modern evangelicals,
Okay.
which is typically defined as people who claim to be born again, or they're really post-Protestant is what they are. They're certainly non-Catholic. When you look at that, the statistics, theologically speaking, according to Ligonier State of Theology, Lifeway was involved in that.
Okay.
You have an incredibly high number of people, 43% that do not believe that Jesus is God. I mean, they believe that he is the first and greatest creation of God.
That's what it was.
Yeah.
What was the percentage again?
I think it's 43. I can look back at
Yeah, so it's some what? Do you have the stat?
No.
It's just some unbelievable percentage of people, and the statement is, do you believe that Jesus Christ is the first and most beautiful creation of God? Right? Isn't that something like that?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's like 40-something% of evangelical, is that what it is? Christians
Yeah.
believe that, which means they're all Arians.
So, yeah, Jesus is the first and greatest being created by God.
What?
40% strongly agree with that.
That's what it was.
Which means there's a higher percentage of those who do agree with that statement. But 40% strongly agree, and then it kind of goes down to some are like,
Is that even possible? That can't be right.
It is. It's very possible.
Arianism was never completely stamped out.
Well, it took a
They-
few councils, didn't it?
Well, when
the study also says Jesus was a great teacher, but he was not God, and 31% strongly agree with that. Now, again, it's over 50% that agree with that statement, but 31% strongly agree, just like on the other one.
So
40% strongly.
that means
agree, which pushes
it's
up to
impossible now that we
60%.
have, now that the schism has, and we don't have any universal authority to call a council. But even if we could call a council, it would be impossible because we don't have a shared foundation even to begin with.
Yeah.
I mean, it's like somebody was talking about like the Christian lexicon, like Christianese, like the council's basically created. I don't know if it created, but like
Bingham.
yeah, we basically created and codified like Christian language, like terms that was like specifically Christian, like, and it was a whole nother language.
Yeah.
And now I find like, and you guys have these conversations with other Christians all the time where like, you realize very quickly, like we have two totally different vocabularies.
Yeah.
Like we're not talking about the same thing here, pick a topic, but the words are different. There's words they've never heard. There's words I've heard that they are meaning one thing by that I'm not understanding it. I mean, it's like, I don't know. It's like two different Christianities,
Yeah, well, I think it goes back to our conversation a few weeks ago with Dr. East.
Oh yeah.
That so many of our evangelical brethren, and I mean they do a lot of really, really good stuff, but when you stop confessing the creeds, heresy can come in pretty easy.
Well,
Might take a few generations, but
40% think
Yeah.
that Jesus is a created being.
that's strongly agree.
I'm still
So
baffled by that.
back in the spring, I, with some other men at my church, taught through the Nicene Creed.
Yeah.
And and so when I introduced the creed and why we needed it, we talked about Arius and the heresies then. And you can see how people kind of sit like, yeah, we're safe. We don't believe that, or we don't live in that world. it was kind of a history lesson. And then I said, well, modern Arians look like Mormons and Jehovah's Witnesses. And that made it a little bit more real, like, oh, yeah, we've run into those people. And then I pulled out the stats from Ligonier's State of Theology study, and it was like a grievous moment for many people to realize I have family and friends in those communities that probably
Most likely
would say
believe it,
that
yeah.
kind of thing.
It's interesting when you don't say begotten, not created every single Sunday.
Well, yeah, you take that out of the imagination and the confession of a Christian's heart.
Right.
Well, and if I'm wrong about this, I can be corrected. But I will say one of the lecturers, and I believe it was Dr. Bingham, who made the point, maybe others made it as well, that one of the things you saw happening with the creeds, or at the councils, I should say, is when heresies arose, they often arose from people who were trying to do sort of Bible-only theology. And he was making the point that that's the same thing we have happening today.
Right.
And I thought it was interesting coming from a Baptist scholar, right? And that's not a criticism of him. I mean,
Sure.
he was brilliant, but that was his point. Like, he's coming from that world where when people are doing Bible-only
Right.
theology, it's only about 30 seconds before they're dabbling in heresies.
Right. And his point, was because we end up looking at text in isolation.
Yeah.
Right.
And not in the complete canonical understanding of theology, which was what he was advocating for.
And then within the larger tradition of the church.
Yeah.
Right. So the full canon, Scripture interpreting Scripture, and then with the collective understanding of the church, of what the church has said about these things, he made a really strong case.
Yeah.
As
Well, in the
a-
Q&A, I loved when he made the point, because of a question, but he made the point about how necessary it is for us to cultivate the 4 readings of Scripture and not get locked into the grammatical, historical,
Yeah,
which
I was
is
really
so good.
surprised
I was
that
like,
he-
wow, man.
he kind of named it and claimed
I
it.
wanted to stand up and cheer at that point, but
Yeah, I saw somebody post I think it was an Eastern Orthodox priest, a comment about that. And one of my mutual friends, he made a point that I had never been able to articulate until he made it. But it's so true that academic biblical studies or religious studies, it is a religion of itself, Right, because they're always looking for creative ways to reinterpret or to interpret the text, and
So you're saying there's a tendency to innovation within
yes, absolutely,
that.
that's how you do PhDs.
right. You have to
gotta
have
have a
something new
new
to talk
thing.
about,
I
right?
have something new to say. Well, Jesus is a created being. Well, wait, that's already been said.
Very
before,
Athenian
Yeah, and so
to
many
an unknown God.
so many professors and students are they're locked in that for years, and it almost becomes a cult.
Looking for gnosis that no one else knows.
Yeah,
and
right.
take pride in
Yes,
that.
the untapped gnosis. So we have secret knowledge over here,
Right.
and I got to stumble upon it if I'm going to get published.
Right.
I got to say something that's going to make sense, or at least get somebody's attention.
And so many of those interpretations, you see these big new academic books coming out, and they're about essentially the premise is stuff that's heretical by the standards of the ecumenical councils.
So what happens when you?
The man Jesus Christ,
Right.
which is obviously in the Bible,
Well, sure, he was a man.
but he's also divine.
Yes.
but only focusing on his manhood,
Right.
or whatever it might be. That's one example. But there's dozens upon dozens of the most cutting edge scholarship, and it's heretical by the standards of the the councils.
Yeah, and there's another tact that comes into sometimes also is I'm going to give you the options approach, and then they create these they try to make 2 arguments and make
Right.
them equal. Well, one tradition says that this, and the other says this, but if you're taking like the outlying idea against what the church has pronounced to be orthodoxy
Right.
over 2 millennia with councils, et cetera, and now you're trying to like stir up well, but some people think that, you see this all the time with like head coverings, right? The argument of, well, that one school thinks that Paul was just talking to that specific church. But these aren't equal things. Ordination, blah, blah, blah. But they try to create this air of, well, it's like it could be A or B, and A and B are equally valid. But that's not always the case.
Right.
Usually B is not. And B's already been discounted.
We have Pelagianism, B, or Orthodoxy,
Right.
A.
They're
And,
not
you could go either way
Yeah,
with
it's
the
not like
text.
it's not like the Force. It's not like the Empire or the Rebellion, and
Right.
we don't know who's going to win. That's not how this works.
Or Obi-Wan, it's all true from a certain point of view.
Yeah, I don't like that either.
But it's from imbibing in the
You just
cultural
watched
way
that
of thinking,
the other day, didn't you?
where Christianity in itself is just another possibility among several options.
So the pluralism. That's a great observation, actually. Culturally, the Kool-Aid's been drunk. As you said, Christianity is just another one of a myriad of paths or philosophies or content of ideas that could be better or worse or the same, but it really has no preeminence, right? So yeah, great point, Timothy.
In Carl Trueman's book on the Nicene Creed, recently renamed, but he makes the argument that if you set aside creeds as a pastor, then you're going to end up having to address all of the same questions that the creed has already answered. But you're probably not going to come up with an orthodox view on every point.
Right.
And if you start to dabble in heresies or heterodoxies in one area, eventually it's going to affect another area.
Which is why they had so many councils.
That's exactly right. And then extended into the whole the triune God, right? So we get into the Holy Spirit. So once you kind of get off on the main thing, Christology, then you see these tentacles that just kind of, the ship just starts leaking from different points, and you got to keep shoring it up. Somebody brought up, there's a couple other things I want to talk about. So somebody brought up Brad East. Was that you?
That was me.
That was you. We had a lot of feedback on that video podcast.
Yeah.
The first thing was they were just taken aback at how handsome all of us were. I don't know if you guys saw that email.
That's not the feedback I got, but I'm glad.
I had another email that said, "When are you going to get back onto the audio podcast?" So here
You
we
got
are.
a face for radio.
Yeah. So we're back behind the golden microphone, so to speak. But but seriously, I don't know about you guys, but I've had a lot of text, email, and then just running into people that were asking about that conversation with Dr. East and wanted to engage with it and talk about it. But I don't know. What are your? I'm going to go to you, Father Templin. Like, having thought about that conversation, where do you
So I had
land
a
at? Where
gentleman stop me last week at the conference
at AWI.
Yes, I'm not sure what church he's at. I talked to so many people, but he might have been he was at St. Mark's in Waxahachie.
Okay.
And he really enjoyed. He listens to our podcast, but he really enjoyed that episode. But he made the same observation that I was trying to articulate, that I don't think within Dr. East's conceptualization of, low and high, that he really has a good category for Anglicanism.
Okay.
And that's kind of article wise and conversation. And I really agree with a lot of what he said. I think it was really good. And I'd love to talk to him again, but I think he needs to dig a little deeper in what we are, because I think what he's looking for already exists.
Yeah.
I'd like to hear his thoughts on what his understanding of the English Reformation.
Yes.
Now that would be a good follow-up podcast, actually.
I think so.
But I had the same. So when I read the article, before we even talked to him, and then when we did talk to him, we had this discussion. That's my challenge with. Again, I can't deny the statistics.
Sure, absolutely.
So statistically, he's making a valid point that Protestantism, that middle Goldilocks Protestantism, is really almost non-existent, statistically speaking,
In the West.
in the West. However, I felt the same way. By forcing things into two categories, low church evangelicalism and Catholic, right? Those are
Right.
the two categories.
Yeah.
I still feel like I don't know where we are in. Like, we're not really in his frame.
Well, he lumps us in with the Roman
I understand
Catholics
that, but to me, but that doesn't work.
right.
But that just may be because I know what we are, and I know what we do and how we do it and what we bring and offer to the church, the larger church. And for me, it's just not that cut and dry.
No.
So what were some of the things that you maybe learned from that conversation from him, Mark, or maybe something that changed the way you were thinking about things, or just maybe affirmed? What was your take on the conversation?
Well, I enjoyed the conversation and appreciated his joining us and participating. In my circles, that essay really struck a nerve in ways that, it struck a nerve with me, but it really struck a nerve with some other guys in ways that surprised me, because I think it made them stop and think about the situation we're in.
Right.
If you're in the Presbyterian Church in America, for example, some of the elders at our church read that, and it gave them pause. Some of the pastors I know have read it, and it's like, okay, we have some work to do. We have some decisions to make. So I think they felt that, and I do appreciate where East is coming from, and I resonated with so much of that because I've been where he is now, and
Right.
So from that point of view, I think the essay was incredible. I've come across, a friend of mine sent me a follow-up essay that Dr. East wrote. I think it's on Public Forum, or I can't remember the exact place, but it's a fuller explanation of that Goldilocks Protestantism. Yeah.
Okay.
And he covers more ground. I can tell that he's really thinking through some things.
Okay.
And then
Was this after the Everyday Monks engagement?
it was, in
I
fact.
see.
And then I heard him recently on another podcast, and, it just seems that there is something developing within him that I think eventually might come around to answering some of the questions you guys are asking. I think if I'm piecing it together properly, I think maybe that conversation helped him as much as it helped us, because you guys were able to introduce some things to him that weren't quite on the radar, so to speak. And in that essay I mentioned, the second essay, he does mention the REC and some other
Oh, really?
Interesting.
I need to read
Anglican jurisdictions.
Mark,
So
why don't you share that with the Everyday Monks
I will.
text group so we can read that?
I will.
Do you think, in a sense, he's saying that Protestant proper segment of Christianity is going to disappear.
That's what he said.
What do you think about that?
Well, I didn't want to get into statistics,
Yeah.
because I think that would have detracted from his points.
And that we never talk math, politics,
That's
or religion
true.
on the podcast.
That is very true.
So please proceed.
But within confessional Lutheranism and traditional Anglicanism, within Africa, you're talking about. I think I saw in one country there was like 20 million Lutherans in one of these African countries, and then we've got I don't know, 50 or 60 million African Anglicans, and so it's exploding. So I think the death of Protestantism is coinciding with the death of Orthodoxy and Catholicism in the West.
Why do you say that?
Because it's just secularism. I don't think it has anything to do with the confession. I think it has everything to do with people leaving religion. And that's why you talk to evangelicals and they don't believe that Jesus was eternal. Because there's nothing tying them to it. So, like Roman Catholicism, for instance,
Right.
The articles are coming out, it's outpacing Anglicanism in the UK.
Right.
Well, the issue, though, is that's because nobody goes to church in England. The native population doesn't go to church.
It's
So
immigrants,
it's
right?
primarily driven by
Immigrant
immigrants,
populations,
which are people from those countries that I just mentioned that are moving, where religion is exploding. So
Right.
I don't. So I don't think it really addresses. I don't know. I think that there's a bigger issue at play.
Okay.
But I'll leave it there.
What do you got over there, Timothy? What are your thoughts after all that?
He's definitely on a journey, and I'd love to see him just like each one of us sitting here. None of us sitting here are cradle Anglicans.
No.
Sure.
No.
And I love the way he's thinking. But it is interesting that those in the Protestant churches, they won't see themselves as disappearing. But they're the way that they put into practice what they're believing, because lex orandi, lex credendi is not in operation
Right.
in the way that we're thinking. To the point that sitting there, Protestantism will disappear, and they're still sitting there, but it will be something entirely different.
I learned from Francis Schaeffer, like in the first 2 or 3 years of my ministry, just in reading Schaeffer. I think he was referencing Leslie Newbigin. Could be wrong, but the saying, most churches die long before they cease to exist.
Yes.
Was that him?
That's true. Yeah.
And I think that's in concert with what Dr. East is saying about the situation. There are some communities that are dying, and they're going to be dead long before they cease to exist. You see that with the mainline churches, for example.
Yeah.
But But why? What? I mean, couldn't you make an argument that the low evangelical church is the one that's actually susceptible to fading away and declining because of its?
Well, you could, because of,
look at
on
the
one hand,
Episcopal
because of lack of orthodoxy, but it has the appearance of being alive. Jesus wrote some letters about that, right?
Yeah.
To churches that appear to be alive when they're actually dead. That's not my place to judge every community, right? None of us would do that. But the fact that Jesus would say that about churches should give us pause. There are churches that forsake their first love, and they look great on the outside. I mean, they might even be high church, Catholic tradition sort of churches, but they've lost their first love.
Still have the form, but they're denying the power.
The Lord Jesus has a different way of judging these things than sociologists do.
But is he making primarily theological categories between the high and the low, or is this a preference of worship style and aesthetic? Like what's the driving? What would drive someone up or down? And what are they going to? Is it a theological move, or is it a preference move? I don't like the style of music. I want smells and bells. I mean, what do you think this is?
There's probably a mix of both.
But what do you think people? What do you think's driving most people that are on a journey?
Well, I mean, there's a few issues at play. I think a lot of younger folks, and when I say a lot, it's probably much smaller than are leaving the high traditions and going to either secularism or to evangelicalism. But it's something we've talked about multiple times on this podcast, the rootlessness that they have experienced, and they want the creeds, they want the Lord's Supper, they want liturgy, they want tradition.
Right.
Because we're in a culture where tradition has been criminalized in many ways.
But don't those things that Father Templin aren't those in the PCA?
Yes and no. I mean, there is some.
What's the difference?
There is, if you look at the PCA, and my argument is there is nothing more important than the worship of the true and living God.
Oh, I agree with that.
Now, if you're in the PCA, you're in a tradition, a denomination that does not have a constitutional directory of worship. Now, some people would say, well, that's, we're going to be culturally sensitive or missional or, allow for some range of motion and latitude and that sort of thing. Well, but over time, what happens is you end up with all these disparate communities doing their own thing. And that begins to tear at the stability of the denomination. So we have kids that leave our church, they go off to college, and they're looking for a PCA church like our church. Well, they're not going to find it. it's rare to find one like that that's so vibrant and et cetera. So they want to know, why is it so different? What's missing? And there's no way for a college student to answer that question, because you have to get deep into the weeds of, well, we don't have a constitutional directory of worship. And that's just one example of how you can inadvertently destabilize a whole tradition of people. So there have to be anchor points. I mean, the creeds are anchor points, and sacraments are. But we're in a tradition where some of our sister churches take communion once a month or every other week. And that's it. We do it every week, and we also do it for other occasions. But not everyone does that. So you have this just variety, and it's really death by variety, I think.
So sacramentalism
Yes.
is driving it, and I would agree. That's why I ended up, after when I was trying to figure it all out, ended up going the Anglican route,
because you went through the Presbyterian.
I did,
door, didn't
and I never joined the PCA, but I attended a really they're OPC now, but a really conservative traditional PCA church, and it was liturgical, and the Lord's Supper was offered every week. But kind of as Pastor Mark said, I realized that it was almost a unicorn, and I was like, well, I'd rather just go somewhere where they have to do this.
Right. Less option.
Yeah, and I also got introduced to the daily office as well, which was something that I really liked the concept of. I was like, oh, well, there's daily prayers of the church as well. That seems really biblical.
So there was a robust spirituality.
Yeah.
At least a framework for it.
Right. And like I said to Dr. East, I still believed that the Reformation was worth holding on to, but not everything. I mean, not all of the Reformation was the same. And that's how I ended up working my way over here. And, because it preserved what was, or at least in my mind, what was not only best, but really, at least for me, essential.
Right.
So,
Yeah. So a fullness, which it seems to, and that's the problem. When he collapses prayer book Anglicanism, classical Anglicanism into the Catholic category, to me, he's by definition narrowing it, where I think of it in a much more fuller way,
right.
a fullness of Catholicity within the Anglican tradition.
And a participation in the sacraments as well,
Right.
which was a key distinctive in the Reformation, but especially in the Church of England,
Right.
that the Lord's Supper is restored to the people
Yep.
with frequency.
Right. That's right.
So, Rome is reformed now because of Vatican II,
Right.
but that was not the case. You made very infrequent, I should say, communions as a Catholic layperson.
Yeah, and I think
And then you go into a church and, there's 30 priests there and they're all offering a different mass at the exact same time. So there was some air quotes, some magic going on, and yet it wasn't accessible.
right. Which goes back to your earlier point, that, understanding the English Reformation within the broader continental Reformation, but its distinctiveness and the fact that it went on for a while,
Yeah.
it really, you have to have at least some understanding of that to get a sense of the distinctiveness of Anglicanism.
Right.
Even though, let's be honest, we suffer from kind of a little bit of a variety within the Anglican Church, in America, within, the Western culture. It's not monolithic, and maybe there's people they want monolithic.
They do.
And there's a drive for people. We know some young guys. We've talked to people, Timothy, that come in the parish, and you guys engage with people like this. They're wanting, they don't want the nuance. They don't want margin. They want A plus B
Yes.
equals C, and they want a monolithic faith, an expression of that faith, and then they want the worship of that faith, they see the variation in worship and liturgy, whether it's Anglo-Catholic or low church, West End, whatever. They see that as a malleable doctrine,
Yeah.
right? So back to your point, Mark, you go to 5 different PCA churches and you got 5 different ways of doing things.
Yeah.
People then correlate that varying worship styles within a varying doctrine.
Right.
But that's not the case. Always.
And it's
Sometimes it's the case.
no, but
not-
sometimes.
not
But we're
always.
talking about Anglicanism.
Yeah.
I mean, do you know what I'm?
no. I know. I know
What am I
exactly
trying
you
to
mean.
say? You know what I'm trying to say?
Yeah, they want conformity is what they desire, and without there being a universal practice from place to place,
Right.
they see that as a flaw because they're looking for stability. And this is one of the reasons I think orthodoxy is having such a resurgence amongst evangelicals. Because, you know what? You can go to a Catholic church and it's a praise band and all of that sort of stuff. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
And then you've got some Catholics, they only go to Latin Mass.
Right. Yeah.
Because that's the real one.
Right.
But with an orthodoxy, everybody's doing the same dang thing.
It's Borgish.
Yes.
I like the Borg. Not in a bad way. I'm just saying, but that's the approach.
Right. And there's a draw to that.
No. But I think that's what we're kind of unpacking here. What are you going to say, Timothy?
No, Father Templin took the words right out of my mouth. I mean, that was exactly what I was going to say. The young men that you and I know about that you were referring to, when they see all this variation, they become very skeptical and suspicious.
Right.
Right. So
And they
they'll
should.
They'll go to one parish and the priest is wearing a surplice and a stole. And then they'll come to another parish and they're wearing full vestments, in accordance with, classical tradition. The altar may be far more adorned than this other church may be very stark. They don't even have an altar frontal.
Or they're using incense every Sunday.
So they go to the cathedral and they use incense at every mass, and yet they come to another parish and they don't use incense except for high feast days. And some people will read into that an instability of doctrine, a fluidity. But what do you do with that?
I don't know. I mean, it's something I struggle with.
Yeah.
It's not. I'm not going to leave Anglicanism over it,
No.
but I would like to see everybody be on the same page. I think that's far healthier.
Yeah, and so to be fair, let's just talk about the ACNA. So like within churches within the ACNA, it's like the REC. I would say the REC has probably far more conformity.
We do. Everybody has to use the Book of Common
Well, that's
Prayer.
the first thing.
Right.
You don't get to choose what prayer books you use.
Right.
So it's by canon, you have to use certain approved prayer books that the bishops approve.
Right.
And there's also a long tradition and aesthetic and expectation, customary to customary, as how a parish is going to comport itself in worship. There's going to be far less variance in going from morning prayer at a parish in South Dallas to morning prayer to a church in, REC church in Waco, whatever.
And though it's a good thing, it only goes so far. I mean, the prayer book was the attempt for some uniform. I mean, there was even the acts of uniformity, right?
Yeah.
But where do you? I mean, what is the answer to these young men that makes them look elsewhere as if the grass is greener on the other side, and the slip towards ritualism?
Right. Yeah. That's the question of the day. Yeah. And first of all, I think a parish has to be true to its tradition, right?
Sure.
So you got to toe the line according to your bishops. I think that's the first place. But understanding that there is degrees of variance from parish to parish. There's customs, how they're going to do things that vary.
But there should be some places where the customs are not customs.
Meaning?
And I think we as, traditional Anglicans.
Or you're talking about within each parish, there should be things that are standard.
Right. Yeah. So if you go to a C4SO church.
Okay, now you're talking about in the larger Anglican church in North America.
Let's say North American ACNA.
Okay.
And they're not using the prayer book at all.
Well, that's not, no, I'm not talking about that.
No. But I'm saying that should not be a thing.
I agree. I agree.
And whether you have a lower church celebration of the 1928 prayer book or a high church, it's the prayer book that unifies.
Correct. Right.
But when that becomes tangible and or malleable,
Yeah.
optional,
Yeah.
that's where it gets tricky.
So where do you stop erasing the boundaries?
Yes.
And then where does culture step in to fill where
Well,
those
it
boundaries
always- it
were?
always does.
You know, it was,
of
like
course it
we've
does.
talked about women's ordination.
Fills a
of course it
vacuum.
does. Yeah. Yeah, that's but I think you're right, Father Temple. I think it's the prayer book, which is why
Which is next year's conference.
that's right. So
Yes.
At Anglican Way Institute. Yeah.
So
Good
next
plug in
year
for next year's
yeah,
AWI.
next year. Yeah, you got something to say over here?
Well, question. So on this question of uniformity, conformity, as a lot of young people are looking at some of these more ancient traditions, is it fair to say that there's some optical illusion at work? In other words, sometimes when people look at the Roman Catholic Church, they'll talk about, well, it's one church. It's not 20,000 denominations like you evangelicals have. Well, is that true, or is that kind of an optical illusion? You know, are there traditions or communities within that big community that people don't know about right away? It's only when you get in, you go, oh, there is more diversity than I thought.
Yeah.
Well,
for
of
sure.
course. But here's the thing. No one ever experiences the universal. They only understand the universal in the particular. I can't be at every church
Yeah,
on Sunday within the Anglican tradition.
But you can be in every church if they use the prayer book.
Correct. But my point was going to be is that we often think that the universal is whatever I'm experiencing in the particular place that I'm at. We project this parish to everything else within Anglicanism or everything else within Roman Catholicism. Roman Catholicism, like the East, they kind of have this posture, well, we've never really changed anything, right? So they can talk in monolithic terms, even though
Which is not true.
but that's my other point. But it's far easier for them to make that claim because there's just less. It just seems less disruptive over the history of the church. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And I'm reading this back into how we would understand history living now. It's easy to tell. It's easy for a young guy to go, yeah, well, Rome has never really changed. You know, they set the church up on the foundation of the rock, Peter, and it's always been there. And they've kind of done, they have the ability to, I don't want to call it smoke and mirrors because it's not,
no,
but it's far easier for them to make that claim. We've always been what we are in the East, even though we know it's not. Just like Anglicanism is not from the first century till now. Anglicanism it's dynamic,
Sure.
just like every other branch of the church. But I think the fact that we throw a Reformation into the Anglican conversation, that's kind of that's your first disruptor, if you will. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
I mean, people can then start saying, well, yeah, you guys changed things a little bit. And, well, you had a guy that, didn't want to be married to a certain lady. They start throwing all this stuff in, and it begins to kind of, quote, destabilize and make it sound like, well, there's a lot of shucking and jiving going on in the Anglican world where that wasn't happening in Rome or that wasn't happening in the East. And, of course, that's not true.
And this is why I think you have to have a balanced understanding of history,
Right.
to go along with your liturgics and sacramentals.
Yep.
You got to understand the historical side of things.
Yep.
So you could say that about Henry VIII. We can criticize him all day.
Yeah.
But you also had hundreds of thousands of priests that couldn't follow St. Paul's command to be a husband of one wife either.
Well,
It's kind of this give and take.
Right.
So what I would like to see, if I were ever a bishop, which I hope I'm not,
Yeah, well,
but to go back to the early forms and have strict conformity.
right. Liturgical conformity.
Now, I don't know how well that grows churches, but it seems to be working in some areas of Christendom.
Well, and I mean, because you're a well-versed liturgical scholar. No, I'm serious.
Thank you, sir.
I know, I know you're also a humble man, but no, you've studied these things.
It's all the guiso verde.
You've
He's
studied
so
these
better.
things, but I mean, so we see the origins of apostolic liturgies, right, in the earliest church. They're not exactly the same.
No, and
So when you talk about conformity, uniformity, monolithic worship, you're not talking about like jot and tittle.
no. And,
So can you explain that a little bit? I want people to understand what you're talking
this
about.
is something I mentioned several podcasts ago, but it is a historical fact. In the early church, pretty much only bishops celebrated the Eucharist.
Correct.
And on top of that, most bishops had their own liturgy, and
Yes.
and sometimes they were even free form. Justin Martyr talks about that, to his ability, and the Didache references it as well. But there became a time when things got uniform,
Right.
and at the time of the Reformation, there were tons
Right.
of liturgical rites.
Right. How many in pre-Reformation England and before Cranmer, before the
So-
formation of how many rites were really predominant in England?
So the ones that the prayer book used were Bangor, Hereford,
and Salisbury.
York, Salisbury,
Right.
and those weren't the only ones either.
Right. And that wasn't an anomaly within
No.
Western
so
Christendom.
that gets suppressed at the Council of Trent,
Mm-hmm.
and then the Tridentine Mass that ends up getting produced,
Yep.
unless the liturgy was older than 2 or 3. I can't remember what the number. It was like 200 or 300 years. The use of the Roman Mass, it ended up getting suppressed.
Right.
And so there were probably several dozens all over Europe that went away,
Right.
that were recognized as valid Roman Catholic celebrations of the Mass,
Right.
that stopped happening.
Right. So right there. So when you're talking monolithic conformity, it's not without its nuances.
And this is why the article says every national church has the power to
That's right.
decree rites and ceremonies,
That's
because
right.
that was the case prior to the
Right.
Reformation.
Always had been.
It had been, yeah.
From the earliest times of Christianity.
Right.
So yeah, I just think this drive for monolithic, kind of a one size fits all in doctrine and practice, it's still just this utopian desire for purity,
It is.
Yeah.
which I understand that, but in one sense, like let's just take this parish here, St. Benedict's. Like really, we I think small about things. Like I think about 2 miles around this church. Like that's where we're planted. I'm trying to reach the people within 2 miles of this parish. And how we're doing what we're doing is within conformity of our bishops canonically. We're doing what we're supposed to be doing. We're not doing anything the bishop would say, oh, don't stop doing that. We're well within our tradition. We're well within the norms and standards of the Reformed Episcopal Church. But we're different. We have our own personality. We have our own ethos, but yet we're conformed liturgically and sacramentally. Also in our embracing of the threefold rule in prayer book spirituality. So the fundamentals are there.
And that's what I meant earlier. Like that's the kind of conformity that I'm looking for.
Yeah. And I agree with that.
That things might be dressed slightly differently at Chapel of the Cross than they are at St. Benedict.
Yeah, or at the cathedral,
Right. But we're all using the same liturgical service.
Yeah, and it would be very simple for us, and we've done this, where as presbyters, we can move in and out of any of these parishes, and we can celebrate and perform because we know it's all the same.
Right.
In one sense, there is uniformity.
There is.
Because it's rubrical prayer book liturgy.
Yes.
So that's the other thing. We're following the rubrics,
Right.
So, but I think there's a lot to this question as we think about engaging and reaching people in the time that we're living. I think we also suffer sometimes from this idea that Christianity means success means that everybody's a Christian. Like we got to get everybody to come into the church. Well, I would like for that to be the case, but that's never been the case.
Right.
But when your idea and paradigm of mission is that we got to convert every single person, that's a whole different paradigm than actually reaching the people that God brings within the purview of your particular church, within the lives of your parish as they go out into the world.
Right.
And we're not living in, if you had this big circle called the culture, that big circle isn't Christendom, and then the small circle is faithful Christians living within a bubble called secularism. So in other words, we're not Christians in an atheist culture. We're Christians within a Christian culture that kind of has a hangover.
Yeah.
And it's different when you're a Christian trying to be Christians within Christianity. And Christianity is kind of like this malaise that's just kind of hanging over the culture we live in. And you're going to have varying degrees of faithfulness within that big bubble of people that never dawn the door of a church, but will tell you that they love Jesus, to people who pray the daily offices or at church every time there's a feast day. And they're in here on the Lord's Day every Sunday, worshiping in word and sacrament. And that's always been the case. But it's hard to really embrace that as a church planter or as a pastor. And this idea that we got to keep growing. And they got to get everybody converted. Well, it's a weird dynamic to be a Christians within Christianity. Right. And yet Christianity is just kind of like all these levels, varying levels of engagement and caring about
And
it,
every church experiences this because everyone on the church roll is not keeping a pew warm.
Well, you just look within each parish, right?
Right.
You've
That's
got
what I'm
varying
saying.
degrees of engagement.
Yeah.
Part of it's because we're still operating in the ruins of the Christian empire.
That's right. So we're living in an old paradigm.
Right. So if you're a part of a parish, you go to this church, and whether you go or not, this is your home church. Right. And, the Catholics tried to deal with this, in one way. Well, if you miss Mass, it's mortal sin.
Right.
England tried to deal with this during the Reformation. You must attend at least these 3 Sundays and receive Holy Communion.
You want to be in good standing.
Right. Or we're going to fine you.
Yeah, we'll find you. And then we'll send the verger to come around looking for you and knock on the door and receive your tithe.
And, when you go back to the early church, they probably couldn't even conceptualize this, right? It's just like, man, whoever can get here.
Yeah, I mean, in a sense, we're and maybe this is, okay, so even in Christendom, so you have whole empires are, quote, Christian. I mean, there's no way that we would believe that every person in that kingdom who were in the Christian kingdom were fervent, zealous,
No.
God-fearing, faithful Christians.
Just
It's
like,
not the case.
Just like every Jew was not
Right.
a faithful Jew.
That's right. So I don't think it's any different now. And then you throw on top of that, as you mentioned earlier, Michael, now we're in this time of like really just a receding
Yeah.
Christian memory, right? So that bubble called Christianity is actually being eclipsed into something that's just not really Christian. It's just this spiritual, cultural milieu of people finding their way through life. And inside that big bubble is this thing called Christianity. It's just a strange time to be doing mission.
It is. But this circles all the way back to our original question, or like, why are these guys going to Orthodoxy or whatever?
Right.
Or coming to Anglicanism.
Yeah, or coming to us. Right.
For some time, sometimes it's theological, sometimes it's sacramental, sometimes it's liturgical.
Yep.
But I think for a lot of guys, and maybe gals as well, they want the world that went along with it, that the church created, because that component
Right.
is going away too.
Yeah. So now you've hit on the big thing. So not everybody wants to be a Christian,
But they want,
but they want Christendom.
yes,
They want the institutions. They want the love your neighbor. They want to go about their life in peace.
they want beautiful music, beautiful buildings.
They want beautiful. That's right. They want architecture, beautiful architecture. They want to know that the church is worshiping over there.
right. They want the festivals.
They may even bring their child and get them baptized at somebody's church, and then
Sure.
go along their merry way for the rest of their lives until something bad happens. But this is not new.
Right.
But that defines, I think, our moment in time better than anything. That's the world we're living in. People want the Christian thing
Yes.
around them. They want to live within a Christian world. They just don't want Jesus.
Well, and this is something that, and maybe they do want Jesus,
Well, I don't know.
Some of them may.
Well, maybe.
But I think this is something that we are doing exceptionally well, at least in
What is
our
that?
Reformed Episcopal Church parishes.
Okay.
We are providing not only the Christian faith and worship, but we're also providing the Christian tradition and fellowship and neighborliness.
A life,
Yeah, the life.
a beautiful life.
Right. And we can't do it all over Rockwall. It's, we can't go back to medieval
No.
England or something like that. But you can at least do it here at your parish, shared meals together or men's group or whatever things we're doing.
Right.
And having those kind of touch points.
That's how St. Patrick went about it. I mean, it was
Right.
explained beautifully in George Hunter's book, The Celtic Way of Evangelism. You know, they go in and belonging comes first.
Right.
You know, and then believing,
Right.
then becoming.
That's right. But you're both making the point, like that life that we envision for ourselves, that the Christian life of community and family and a place where you belong and being known by people and knowing people and being loved and loving people. That is the apology. That's the apologetic.
Yeah.
It's putting a subculture or a picture of heaven, redeemed humanity, putting that forward in the distinct and wonderful and sometimes crazy way that a little parish like ours will do. But it's creating a culture and a world and a life that is attracting to some people because venture to say most people are not happy with the world they're living in.
No.
Meaning not this world, meaning the world they've created for themselves,
Yeah.
right? There's a lot of dissatisfaction. There's a lot of personal sadness. There's a lot of striving to create something that they've got in their mind that would be great and beautiful, but it's usually elusive, and it's usually, if they get a little bit of it, it's disappointing. You know, people are looking for another way to live, and they don't know sometimes that it's actually in following Christ,
Right.
because maybe they've not seen a community or seen a way of being and in relationship that actually looks different from everything else they've been trying to do.
That's exactly right. And so I think, as maybe we're talking to some priests that are their churches are small,
Yeah.
and not like this place is massive, but it has grown in comparison to.
Talking about this parish?
Yes.
Yeah,
and-
we've grown a little bit. Yeah.
But so much of that, I think, is A, what we do at the altar, but B, what we do community wise. Because if you want to grow, a lot of people, there's that subset we're talking about that are looking for the church tradition.
Right.
There's also that subset that are just trying to find stability. And then when you do both of them,
Correct.
that you're going to draw in from two different wells.
And see, and what's common in both of those things is relationship.
Yes.
So Stefan Pass, who I just stumbled across a year or two ago, and I was doing some research for how to plant churches in the secular West. Well, anyway, I find this guy on a podcast. Come to find out, he's like really famous. Everybody else knew who he was except me. So I'm reading this book, and he's going to be speaking. Actually, he's going to be doing our plenary at the Reformed Episcopal REC 100 Church Planting Conference in York, in England, in about a week. But he wrote this book called Pilgrims and Priests, and he's developing a missional spirituality. He teaches at the Free University in Amsterdam, missiologist, neat guy. But he's got this whole section in his book where he's talking about like salvation occurs in community. I mean,
does.
it's such an easy idea to think about, but I'd never really thought about it that simply. Because think about it, you're brought into reunion with the triune God in salvation. You're brought into community with God. Well, it happens as well within community of the church.
Yeah.
So you got to put forward a community that's going to actually draw people into it.
Right.
And he connects both the embodiment of the altar and the sacrament and the worship of the church is being extended through the life of the church in every aspect that it does stuff. So that koinonia is what the community, that's what we're talking about. But then that koinonia flowing from the sacrament of the altar into every aspect of communal life of the parish.
Which is precisely Paul's point. You know,
That's exactly right.
This is and that's his, allusion to the body of Christ as well.
And then what happens was when people come in looking for the pure church, or they're, these guys that come in, I'm looking for tradition, orthodoxy, liturgy, something rooted, all those things.
Yeah.
They can come in here and find those things, but if they don't get embedded relationally into the community and give themselves to others and allow others to give themselves to them, those people will eventually float off. Because even though they've found intellectually what they think they've been looking for in terms of doctrine or monolithic faith, whatever, if it's not incarnated in relationship, first through the sacrament with Christ, and then sacramentally with the rest of the parish,
It's pretty.
they're not going to stay. They're not going to stay. They're going to drift to the next place.
It's pretty powerful when someone comes in and the fellowship that is happening changes their imagination,
Yes.
because they are witnessing the real thing, the real deal, the real koinonia.
Right.
When their imagination moves away from the culture that they've been in, it's engaged into real worship. They understand that now spirituality isn't this ineffable thing.
Right.
And they're seeing this played out, like you said, in the koinonia of the church. Is a very powerful thing once their imagination is engaged, and then once they themselves are engaged, and then go into participation.
And that's my sacramental imagination, developing theology of sacrament. Because until they get the idea of the union and participation with God through the Holy Communion, their understanding of their engagement in relationship with you or the next person in the pew or their friends, it's always going to be limited. If you don't have a participation paradigm, he and us and we and him,
Yeah.
then your relationships are going to always come to there's going to be a wall between you.
Well, it'll just be me and Jesus,
So
but in a different, at a different level.
Yeah.
So there's a difference between my relationship with Father Templin within this parish sacramentally by sharing the same Eucharist is different. It's not standing next to each other. It's somehow being together, like sharing in each other. It's the same misunderstanding of marriage in lots of Christian circles because they don't have a sacramental understanding of marriage. So they don't have a paradigm for two becoming one, coherence. Theirs is we're just going to get as near to each other as we can, but we're never one. We're just next to each other. There's a difference between in and next. And if you can't put yourself in a position to have a sacramental understanding of relational unity formed through the liturgy and the doctrine and the catechesis of the church, it's going to be very difficult then to appreciate and be given even further and embedded further into community life. That's why small groups work until people just find somebody else that they'd rather hang out with. Because it's an association of shared interest versus koinonia is different.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly.
There's union in koinonia. Am that making any sense?
No, it does. Yeah.
I think this is
thinking
what the Benedict option was trying to get across, and for the life of me, I can't understand why so many people misunderstood it, misunderstood the meat of the message.
Yeah.
Well, that's
Well, they
because
viewed it as retreat.
Well, that's the thing.
Tiding. And I was thinking about, so this is wonderful conversation. Years ago, John Piper made the comment that missions exist because worship doesn't.
Yeah.
Right?
yeah, that opens
Let the nations be glad.
that opens that book, doesn't it? That's the
Yeah,
first
it
sentence.
does.
Yeah.
I've thought about that over the years, but I felt like there was some missing piece. I couldn't quite figure out what is the missing piece. What is the connection between mission and worship? And a couple of years ago, I believe it was at AWI, Bishop Sutton preached on the Great Commission. I don't know if you guys remember this, but he talked about how we ascend up in Christ and receive the sacrament, and now we have Christ in us and we're with him, and he sends us back out into the world to go find himself, right? To go find Christ. And that was the missing piece for me, the sacramental piece that pulls the two, worship and mission, together. For this reason you're talking about, it's the koinonia, the participation in the body and blood of Christ at the altar and table, but also participation in the body of Christ with each other.
Yeah.
And then as the body of Christ, going out into the world among the poor, the naked, the blind, and whoever they are, because that's where Jesus is hiding, waiting on us to come and find him. And the healthiest churches I know of, the healthiest congregations I know of, have found a way, even if they just stumbled upon it blindly, they found a way to keep mission and worship together and not let them compete. And in my experience, so much of it has been kind of one or the other. You know, you're either going to be liturgical or missional.
Right.
Well, why can't you do both? Well, you have to be sacramental to do both.
Yes.
That's the missing piece. So if you don't have the sacraments in place, then you are going to have these competing approaches to ministry.
Right. And that's where you get the confusion, because the other coin is, well, then worship becomes mission.
Yeah.
Right. So
Let's have an evangelistic
our evangelism
service.
is our service.
Yeah.
Right. And we don't really know who we're preaching to or who's worshiping with us.
Seeker
It could be anybody,
sensitive and all of that.
Yeah.
Okay.
If we just went back to Acts 2:42.
Back to the,
Well, even, you know, I know you're kind of joking, but that
No, I'm
is
being serious.
it's foundational. But even before that, I'm just struck by the fact that, again, Francis Schaeffer in Marks of a True Christian talks about the necessity of love and unity within the body of Christ. And if you think about what Jesus said there, he doesn't say, if you have the right mission, if you have the right liturgics, if you have the right doctrine, you fill in the blank, then the world will know you're my followers. He says, if you love one another as I loved you.
right.
And that's the part that gets left out, the as I loved you, the sacrificial, serving kind of love. But that's what is attractive to people, because they don't see that everywhere. In a dog-eat-dog world, they can't imagine that somebody would actually offer them a cup of water when they're thirsty without any strings attached. So it is a beautiful thing to see a parish of people that love and care for each other in quiet ways, but they're doing it because the Spirit of Christ is at work in them.
Yeah. Agreed. Well, how about we leave it there? Well, what exactly did we talk about today? Mission.
This was a
Church
show
planting.
about nothing. It's very Seinfeld episode.
I take
here.
away from this. I was happy to participate on a video podcast yesterday with some of our brothers in another part of the Anglican tradition on church planting with Canon Tony Melton. And we were talking about, he was saying, 3 things, deep community, commitment to catechesis, and beautiful, engaging worship. And, those are really the three things. And we have all those things in the Anglican tradition. So that's a sense of actually just doubling down on those things and getting creative. And how then do we continue to bring a sacramental imagination to that and pushing those things out, but not compromising anything,
Sure.
but offering something that's rooted and real, in the tradition. And I think that's kind of what we're trying to do. Okay, well, does anybody have anything else to say? It's been nice to get back together again. We'll figure out kind of what the rest of this summer looks like. I look forward to the next podcast.
Should we ask our listeners?
It won't be next
for
week because you're
ideas?
going.
Well, I'm going to be going to Europe, but we're going to try and do another podcast before I leave. But we were talking about
Why are you going to Europe?
Because we're the REC 100 church planting in Europe. Then we do a conference every year, training, and so I'll be in York, England, with our brothers from Free Church of England and other parts of Europe, Germany, Croatia, Serbia, Holland, etc.
And what is your role in all of that?
I help facilitate the conversation, and it's great. It's a blessing. So anyway,
putting his new role as canon into action.
Yeah, so I was made a canon missioner for the Diocese of Mid-America.
We witnessed that.
last
Congratulations.
week. Thank you.
Yes.
I'm very humbled and
Canon missioner.
happy to assist our dear Bishop Sutton and the
It's wonderful.
and the mission of planting missions, as they say. All right. Well, it's been fun to be back together, and I look forward to being with you guys and having all of you out there in podcast land join us on the next episode of Everyday Monks.